Okay, so moving along, and then in Steiner's commentary to the Gospel of Mark, I want to cover two lectures, lectures 7 and 8, during this one video, because lecture 7 is mostly just a sort of warm-up to lecture 8, which moves up into Mark 9 with the transfiguration on the Mount. Basically the gist of 7 is that he contrasts the differences between India, what's going on in India, with what's going on in the West, vis-a-vis his previous comparison between the clairvoyant traditions that are dying out in the East. The sentient soul is dying out, and the Buddha is the sort of last straggler of this tradition. And then he says that Indian philosophy, though, never fully achieved the kind of conceptual clarity that the West was starting to move into as it shifted from the time of, let's say, Hesiod and the philosopher Pherecydes into the period of the pre-Socratics, where logic begins to come in, logic and reason, concepts. The ego begins to use concepts to replace this gradual diminution of clairvoyance. And clairvoyance for Steiner means simply seeing, the ability to see into the spiritual world, which was at its apex for him during the Atlantis period. And all 7 of the post-Atlantean civilizations represent a slow and gradual diminution and loss of the human ability to see into the spiritual worlds, a loss of clairvoyance, in other words. And basically, this is also, he's chronicling the shift from what Jean Gebser calls the mythical consciousness structure into, with the Greek pre-Socratic philosophers, the rational or mental consciousness structure. And so he says that in India, sort of what took place was, in order to supplement the loss of the clairvoyant traditions, yoga came in, and yoga comes in with the Upanishads about 800 BC, and marks this shift into a kind of, yoga is a kind of artificial clairvoyance. They're using concepts now, and they still have a few dying echoes of the clairvoyant traditions, which is to say a thinking in mythical images. That's basically what he means by clairvoyance, being able to see into the spiritual world. Although this is not a Jungian reductionism of Jung is guilty of reducing everything to mere projections out of the collective unconscious. That's not what Steiner means by clairvoyance. He means that you are actually able to see into another dimension, a spiritual realm, and sort of download information from that dimension, which I think is much closer to the actuality, the real truth of things, than Jung's reductionistic attempt to capture everything and confine it into the human psyche as simply metaphors. That won't do. Jungian reductionism need not apply here in Steiner's world. And so what happens is that, so we get the pre-Socratics coming on stage, Steiner says in lecture 7, and that they slowly are, they're yearning for something, but don't quite realize that they're yearning for the Golgotha mystery, the mystery of Golgotha, something that will awaken, that will make the ego not just capable of juggling abstract concepts like being and becoming, and Heraclitus with the world fire, and Empedocles with love and strife and so forth, but actually light it up with the supersensible world, so that it will not be the case, as in previous traditions, that there's nothing in Steiner that's a regression. It's not a regression back to the mythical consciousness structure. It's retaining certain aspects of the spiritual world in combination with the ego and its discerning abilities that it has brought into being, with the ego's ability to handle abstract concepts with the pre-Socratics. So this is a higher turn of the spiral. It's not a regression in any way, shape, or form. And so then with lecture 8, which I think is a tour de force of Steinerian biblical scholarship, he moves into his readings of 3 different episodes from the Mark Gospel, from, let's see, Mark 9, and then he goes to Mark 14, and then comes back to Mark 11. With Mark 9, he talks about the transfiguration on the Mount, and then with Mark 14, the woman who pours a flask of ointment, of oil over his head, and then with Mark 11, the fig tree episode where he curses a fig tree. So first he says, now it's interesting with regard to the transfiguration on the Mount, because here Christ takes up to this mountain with him Peter, James, and John, and notice that these are the first 3. Only Andrew is missing from the first 4 disciples that he had gathered around himself right at the beginning of the gospel. So he takes 3 of those original 4 with him up to the mountain. And then Steiner says that anytime in occult traditions that you either ascend up a mountain or move into the area of a lake, of a body of water, or into a house. Like he says, if you glance back at the beginnings of the gospel, when Christ pushes himself out onto a lake in Mark 3:7, going down through 19, he pushes himself out onto a lake with the boat, and then moves from the boat to go up to a mountain. And it's the first time that he actually ascends a mountain. And here he names all 12 of his disciples on this mountain. So it's an elevated plateau. And he changes Simon's name to Peter. And then he gives to James and John the name, the Boanerges, the sons of thunder. So something is happening on this mountain that has to do with an initiation into occult knowledge. And then it says that Christ goes back to his house. And when he goes back to his house, his family thinks he's gone insane. It says that he was, and when his family heard him, they went out to seize him. For people were saying he's beside himself in his house, which is another way of saying that he's gone mad. So Steiner says each of these areas, the lake, the mountain, and the house, in occult traditions signify a special type of awakening or awareness of occult knowledge. And he says that with regard to a lake, and you can fast forward to the lake episode when he walks on water, which occurs Mark 7, Mark 7:49, 48:49, and he appears to the disciples. He goes up onto a mountain, and they're back in a boat, and they're having a rough time on the waters, and then they see his spirit. And they mistake him for a ghost. They think he's a ghost walking on water. And Gene Gebser, in the Ever-Present Origin, says that the symbolism of that is that Christ is now paving the way for the mental consciousness structure in the next phase by resisting a resubmergence back into the psyche, back into the astral world of the mythical and magical consciousness structures. The symbolism of him resisting the watery abyss. And in a way, think of the opening image of the gospel where John baptizes him, and it's as though he's emerging out of the water. Right when it starts, like the scene at the end of Apocalypse Now, when Willard is about to kill Kurtzen, and it shows him just surfacing out of the water. In a way, the Mark Gospel almost starts with that very image, with Christ coming up out of the mythical realm of the watery abyss. But he's not going to just send us back to it. This is not a regression to the abyss, which is the symbolism of him walking on water and resisting that resubmergence into what Jung would call the unconscious or the collective unconscious, reductively. It's a stabilization now of the ego. So he says, so the significance now then, with regard to the lake, is that when in these stories and narratives, an individual is in a lake or on a lake or in association with water, what we have is the activation of what he calls imaginative cognition. And imaginative cognition is one of the three higher faculties that he associates with the manas, the buddhi, and the atman, or the spirit self, life spirit, and spirit body. And imaginative cognition is basically the Jungian collective unconscious. It has to do with a learning how to think in terms of pictorial images, imaginative images. And indeed, I think it's significant that Jung spent his whole life on or near lakes. He built the tower at Bollingen near a lake. He was born right next to Lake Constance in Zurich, which he lived at right near, off and on for most of his life. The lake, the water activates the collective unconscious, the abyss. And then Steiner then says, so with regard to a mountain, anytime we have an ascent in occult traditions up a mountain, we have the activation of inspiration, which is the next level up from the manas to the buddhi, or from the spirit self to the life spirit, where we have inspiration now, which is an openness to a receptivity to receive spiritual beings, messages from spiritual beings that descend down into one, which is, of course, a very old symbolism. This is the whole symbolism of the building in Sumer of the great ziggurats, which are steps. The Babylonian ziggurat was 7 steps to correspond to the 7 heavenly spheres, and at the top you would go to the temple there, and the gods would come down like the spaceship at the end of Close Encounters of the Third Kind to meet with you. That's inspiration. Inspirited. You were inspirited in this meeting between the human, the temporal, the ephemeral, and the eternal, the divine, the God. And the third faculty is, of course, intuition, which has to do with the ability to read the Akashic record and see into your past lives and so forth. But he doesn't talk about that here, just these upper two with regard to lake symbolism and mountain symbolism. And then when Christ returns to his house and his family thinks he's mad, he just says that the house can block, returning back to one's domesticity can actually block or interfere with the ability to have spiritual visions. A town even more so. And so I think that's interesting. By the time Christ gets to Jerusalem, when he gets there, the miracles stop happening. Take note of that. There's a couple outside the city, but he begins to lose that occult ability once he gets into Jerusalem to perform miracles and have these kinds of visions. And he's right. The town, the citified world, begins to block the mind's receptivity to the supersensible cognition, to the higher worlds. So then getting back then to Mark 9 specifically with the transfiguration on the mount. So Christ then takes up Peter, James, and John up with him onto this mountain where he receives this inspiration and sort of, in a way, transfigures himself into this sort of blinding white light, this radiant being that's depicted in the mind's eye, I think, for all time by Raphael's painting of the Transfiguration, with him sort of, his robes are bleached completely white, and it's like he takes off his face and it's just this blinding, numinous radiance. This is the God. This is the being that has come down from the sun, that exists in Jesus of Nazareth, and now here he is. And Peter, James, and John are completely in awe, and appearing to either side of him are, of course, Moses and Elijah. And Steiner says this is a confluence. In a way, it's the climax of the whole development of relationship to the disciples before the Golgotha mystery, before they get to Jerusalem, where he just sort of reveals himself as the Christ being, this sun God incarnate in human form on earth. And that all three traditions, represented by Moses on the one hand and Elijah on the other, and Christ himself, sort of come together in this apotheosis, this true epiphany, this manifestation of the divine on earth. Moses, he says, remember, inherits, he's talked elsewhere about Moses inheriting the etheric body of Zarathustra, inheriting that etheric body, and then also when he is initiated by the Midianite priest Jethro into the mysteries of initiation, not only initiation into the mysteries of Judaism, but also he teaches to Moses other people's mysteries, other people's types of initiation into the mysteries, because the Jewish form of initiation into the mysteries is different from other people's, Steiner says, in that it comes out of the prophetic tradition. It doesn't have the same structure that these other peoples have. So Moses continues this, and then with regard to Elijah, of course, we have Elijah, as Steiner has already said, is the sort of group soul that has now taken up residence within the 12. But also the fact, he points out here that he thinks Elijah is the reincarnation of a character named Phinehas, which is an obscure character who is the grandson of Aaron. So we have Moses and Aaron, the founder of the priestly line, and Moses of the kingly line, the line of rulership, and then Aaron's son Eliezer, and then Phinehas, who is his grandson. And Steiner says, Phinehas is reincarnated in Elijah, who then is later reincarnated as John the Baptist, who then, as he says in other lectures, will later reincarnate, believe it or not, as the painter Raphael, and then again as the German poet Novalis. So that's a separate topic. But nonetheless, the point is that Elijah continues the tradition going all the way back to the priestly line. And so all three of these streams come together with this transfiguration on the mount. The Golgotha mystery with Christ as the sun God that has come down, Moses continuing the traditions of Judaic initiations, and the connection to the priestly line with Elijah being the reincarnation of Phinehas, the grandson of Aaron. So that's his wonderful reading of the Transfiguration on the Mount. Then he jumps ahead to Mark 14, which is the episode where they're in Jerusalem now at this point. I think it's Wednesday. I think they've entered the city on Monday, if I recall. It looks like it might have been Tuesday. And he's there in the house with the disciples, and a woman is there, and there's a very expensive flask of oil, some special type of anointment that's sealed, And the woman breaks it open to the horror of the disciples because, and she pours it over Christ's head because they could have sold that for 300 denarii and distributed that money to the poor, which is what they say to Christ. And he says, the thing about this is that the poor will always be among you. You'll have plenty of opportunities to distribute alms to them. I will not be with you forever. And what this woman has done will be remembered. So she's preparing him for burial. You anoint a body when you prepare it for burial. So this is, and it's immediately followed then by the paragraph on Judas, who goes immediately to the priests to betray him. And of course, he's paid for his betrayal 30 silver gold coins. And so Steiner makes the point that, notice that. So Judas is guilty of money, of greed, he's still stuck in the realm of sensory things. And he has witnessed this, so what appears to be Christ throwing away money. And we should have given this money to the poor. But in actual fact, Steiner says the point of it is that there are certain things that belong to Caesar. There are certain things that belong to God here. And God represents the supersensible world. And the disciples are missing. They're not catching the esoteric significance. They're missing the connection to the spiritual world that is represented here. They're strictly thinking in terms of the materialistic value of what they could have gotten for this. So that's the point of that passage, Steiner says, is this differentiation between the disciples and especially Judas Iscariot being too attached to the sense world, the sense perceptible world, the world of economics and pragmatics, the world of Caesar, rather than the spirit world, the supersensible world of spiritual cognition and the occult significance of the mystery event, which is designed to shift the mind away from the physical plane to the spiritual. That's the whole point of what's going on here. And Christ is sad, I think, that his disciples are missing the point. Then finally, Steiner finishes by looking back at Mark 11 with the curious episode of the fig tree. And it is a little weird. I remember first reading this, Mark 11, being a bit puzzled by it, where Christ all of a sudden is hungry. And he says, I'm going to go out and get some figs. So he goes out and he finds this fig tree that has only leaves on it, but there's no figs on it because it's not fig season. So he curses the tree and says, you shall never bear fruit. No one will ever eat fruit from you ever. And later they walk by the tree again and they see that it has indeed wilted and died. So Christ has put a curse on it, which has killed it. So Steiner says, it's a little odd, this scene. What's the significance? Christ knows very well that it's not fig season. So what's he doing here? So it's not to be understood literally. It's a spiritual image. He says the fig tree is not producing figs anymore because it's analogous, let's say, to the Bodhi tree under which the Buddha received his messages, his spiritual messages, which were the last dying echoes of the dying realm of clairvoyance, when men could see into the spiritual world with ease and without effort. So the tree will not bear figs anymore. It will not bear any more of those kinds of insights and intuitions. No more Buddhas under Bodhi trees receiving clairvoyant inspirations from the other world. That age is gone. It has died down and passed. That tree will never again bear fruit. The correct tree now that will bear fruit is the tree on the hill of Golgotha, to which Christ is nailed and becomes the fruit of that tree. That is the fruit that we will now eat, not the fruit from the old dying clairvoyant traditions that we already saw Steiner saying that the Greek pre-Socratic thinkers were yearning for, which they had replaced with dry abstract concepts as the mental consciousness structure was coming into being there and the mythical consciousness structure fading out, which is the same thing. Translate that Gebser's language into Steiner's language, and it's the age of the sentient soul, which is the third generation of his post-Atlantean civilizations of Egypt and Mesopotamia. And then the slow loss of that as the intellectual soul with the Greco-Roman period comes in. And for Steiner, the Christ being is the axial event around which his entire model of history pivots. Hegel called it an axial event, and it's the central event for Steiner. Of everything in his philosophy hovers around this event. That's why it's very important to understand his ideas about Christianity and the Christ event, and his own sort of weird, unique creation of his own kind of Gnostic gospel of the fifth gospel that we'll get back to after we go through his lectures on Matthew and Luke and John. So that's Steiner's wonderful esoteric readings of these episodes from Mark. And then next week we have 2 lectures left, 9 and 10, to finish off his commentary on the Gospel of Mark.